Dr. Evan Cole, a compassionate black physician, becomes the target of Officer Daniels, a corrupt and racist cop intent on shutting down Evan's community clinic. What begins as harassment escalates into a public showdown, with Daniels abusing his authority to undermine Evan's work and reputation. The story exposes systemic racism and corruption, highlighting Daniels' long history of targeting minority-owned businesses and abusing his power. As Evan faces relentless injustice, he refuses to back down, using his resilience and determination to rally his community and fight back against the deeply ingrained prejudice threatening to destroy everything he's built. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the city as Dr. Evan Cole stepped out of his townhouse, coffee in hand, ready to tackle another day. The crisp air felt like a promise of new beginnings, but Evan couldn't shake the weight of the challenges waiting for him at Millbrook Memorial Hospital. As one of the nation's top heart surgeons and a respected philanthropist, Evan's name carried immense weight. But here in Millbrook, it often seemed to mean little more than a target. Evan's journey to success was anything but ordinary. Born to working-class parents in the same small town, he had clawed his way to the top through sheer determination and unrelenting discipline. Scholarships paved the way for medical school, and his groundbreaking research made him a sought-after surgeon. Despite offers from prestigious institutions in larger cities, Evan chose to return to Millbrook, a decision that puzzled many of his colleagues. "Why stay in a town that doesn't appreciate you?" they'd ask. But Evan had always believed in giving back. His success wasn't just his. It was a victory for everyone who had supported him along the way. Yet, even with his achievements, he often found himself facing skepticism, doubt, and at times, outright hostility. The streets of Millbrook were quiet as Evan strolled toward his favorite diner, Clara's Place. It was a humble spot with checkered tablecloths and the best coffee in town, according to Evan, anyway. Clara, the owner, had been running the place for decades, and her warm demeanor made it feel like a second home. "Morning, Dr. Cole," Clara called from behind the counter as he entered. "Morning, Clara," Evan replied, offering her a smile. "I'll take the usual." Clara winked, already pouring his coffee. "You've got it." As Evan settled into his usual booth by the window, he pulled out his tablet to catch up on emails. The hospital board meeting was in a few hours, and there were dozens of urgent items on his agenda: funding for a new wing, staffing shortages, and his ongoing battle to expand the free clinic program, all topics that were vital to him but often met with resistance. Millbrook wasn't just struggling economically, it was fractured. The wealth gap between its residents was glaring, and racial tensions simmered beneath the surface. As a black man in a position of power, Evan felt those tensions more acutely than most. He was celebrated for his successes, but often reminded, subtly or otherwise, that he didn't entirely belong. Evan had just taken a sip of his coffee when the bell above the diner's door jingled. 2 police officers stepped inside, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. They were regulars, often seen at Clara's during their morning patrols, but today, their energy felt different, tense, almost predatory. Evan noticed them glance his way, but quickly returned to his emails. He was used to drawing attention, though it still made him uncomfortable. He focused on his inbox, replying to a message from the clinic director, when a shadow fell across his table. "Dr. Cole, right?" one of the officers asked. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. Evan looked up to find Officer Daniels, a burly man with a reputation for being overly aggressive, standing before him. Beside him was a younger officer, Whitaker, whose nervous energy betrayed his inexperience. "That's me," Evan replied, setting his tablet aside. "Can I help you?" Daniels leaned against the booth, his arms crossed. "We've had some reports about suspicious activity around the clinic you've been running." Evan's brow furrowed. "Suspicious activity? I'm not sure I follow." Daniel's smirk was more condescending than reassuring. "Loitering noise complaints, people coming and going at odd hours. You know how it is." "I'm aware of the clinic's operations," Evan said evenly. "It's open late to accommodate people who work during the day. As for loitering, we've had community volunteers working outside to improve the space." Daniels tilted his head, as if unimpressed by the explanation. "Well, we'll be keeping an eye on it. Don't want anything unsavory happening on your watch." Evan met Daniels' gaze, his expression calm but firm. "If you have concerns, Officer Daniels, I suggest you bring them to the board. I'd be happy to address them officially." Whitaker shifted uncomfortably, but Daniels' smirk remained. "Sure thing, Doc, just thought I'd give you a heads up." As the officers walked away, Clara approached the table, a frown creasing her face. "Don't let him get to you," she said softly, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of Evan. "Daniels likes to throw his weight around." Evan offered her a reassuring smile, though inside he felt the familiar sting of frustration. "I'll be fine, Clara, thanks." But as he watched the officers leave the diner, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The encounter lingered in Evan's mind as he made his way to the hospital. Daniel's tone, the thinly veiled accusations, it all pointed to something deeper than a simple misunderstanding. Millbrook had always been a town of unspoken hierarchies, and Evan's success had clearly disrupted the status quo. Arriving at the hospital, Evan was greeted by familiar faces. Nurses, doctors, and staff nodded as he passed, their respect genuine. But even here, within the walls of his domain, Evan couldn't escape the underlying tensions. The boardroom, in particular, was a battlefield. Today's meeting was no different. As Evan presented his case for expanding the free clinic program, he was met with polite resistance. "Dr. Cole," one board member began, "while we appreciate your dedication, we must consider the hospital's financial health. These programs are a drain on resources." "They're an investment," Evan countered, his tone measured but firm. "The clinic reduces ER visits and improves community health long-term. It saves us money." The debate raged on, but Evan could feel the weight of their unspoken doubts. To some of the board members, his position as chief of surgery wasn't enough. His ideas, no matter how logical, were always met with more scrutiny than those of his peers. By the end of the day, Evan was exhausted but resolute. He knew the challenges he faced weren't just professional, they were personal. The subtle dismissals, the coded language, the veiled threats, they were all part of a larger system designed to keep people like him in their place. As he walked to his car, the cool evening air did little to soothe his frustration. His mind buzzed with questions. How far would Daniels push? Could the clinic survive without broader support? And what would it take to truly change the culture of Millbrook? Evan didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. He wasn't backing down. Evan Cole sat in his office at Millbrook Memorial Hospital, the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the faint beeping of distant monitors, his only companions. He was reviewing the clinic's quarterly reports, but his mind kept drifting back to the morning's encounter with Officer Daniels. The thinly veiled hostility in the officer's voice, and the smug satisfaction in his demeanor. It was a familiar script. One that Evan had played opposite too many times in his life. The phone on his desk buzzed. "Dr. Cole, the board is ready for you," his assistant, Jenna, announced. Evan exhaled sharply, closing the clinic report and grabbing his notes. He'd prepared meticulously for this meeting, knowing the proposal to expand the free clinic program would be met with resistance. Walking into the boardroom, he straightened his tie, steeling himself for what he knew would be an uphill battle. The boardroom was spacious and grand, a testament to the hospital's prestige. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, highlighting the gleaming mahogany table and the neatly arranged chairs. The board members, predominantly older, white men, sat waiting, their expressions ranging from polite indifference to outright skepticism. Evan took his seat at the head of the table. "Thank you all for making time today," he began. "I want to discuss the expansion of the free clinic program and how it can benefit not only the underserved community, but the hospital itself." He launched into his presentation, pointing out the program's success in reducing emergency room overcrowding and improving patient outcomes. He emphasized the long-term cost savings and community goodwill it generated. One board member, Mr. Ellsworth, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Dr. Cole, while your intentions are admirable, we must consider the financial strain on the hospital. These clinics are expensive, and quite frankly, they don't bring in revenue." Evan kept his tone measured. "I understand your concern, Mr. Ellsworth, but the clinic reduces the burden on our emergency services, which are significantly more costly. It's an investment in preventative care." Ellsworth's lips tightened. "Preventative care doesn't pay the bills." A few chuckles rippled through the room, but Evan pressed on. Preventative care reduces long-term costs and builds trust with the community. It also aligns with our mission to provide equitable healthcare. Equitable healthcare, Ellsworth repeated, his tone dripping with condescension. That's a noble ideal, but let's be realistic, Dr. Cole. We can't save everyone. Evan's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. We can save more than we are now, that's the point. Another board member, Mrs. Price, chimed in. Dr. Cole, have you considered focusing on smaller, targeted initiatives? Expanding the program might be too ambitious. Evan nodded, masking his frustration. I appreciate that suggestion, Mrs. Price. However, the data supports a larger expansion. Scaling back would limit our impact. The meeting dragged on, the board members' resistance wearing on Evan's patience. He could feel the implicit doubts in their words. Could he manage such a program? Was it wise to allocate resources to something that primarily benefited marginalized communities? The unspoken prejudices hung in the air, stifling and heavy. By the time the meeting adjourned, Evan felt drained. As the board members filed out, Jenna approached him with a sympathetic look. How'd it go? They're not convinced, Evan admitted, but I'm not giving up. Later that afternoon, Evan received a call from a reporter at the Millbrook Gazette. The tone of the conversation quickly raised his suspicions. Dr. Cole, this is Caroline Harper. I'm working on a piece about the hospital's community programs. I've heard some concerns about the free clinic, specifically that it might be attracting undesirable elements to the area. Evan's grip on the phone tightened. Undesirable elements. Can you clarify what you mean by that? Well, Harper hedged, there have been complaints from nearby residents about noise, loitering, and, frankly, safety concerns. Are these complaints verified? Evan asked, his voice calm but firm. Well, no, Harper admitted, but there's a perception. Perception isn't reality, Ms. Harper, Evan interrupted. The clinic serves hardworking families, many of whom don't have access to regular health care. These are parents bringing their children in for checkups, seniors managing chronic conditions. If there are concerns, I'd encourage those residents to visit the clinic and see the work we're doing. Harper hesitated before responding. I see. Thank you for your time, Dr. Cole. As he hung up, Evan leaned back in his chair, frustration bubbling beneath his composed exterior. The call wasn't an innocent inquiry, it was part of a pattern. Doubts about the clinic's purpose, concerns about its clientele, whispers designed to undermine its legitimacy. That evening, Evan stopped by the clinic. The waiting room was bustling with patients, parents soothing fussy toddlers, a teenager studying a school textbook, an elderly man chatting with a volunteer. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the hostility Evan had faced earlier. As he spoke with the clinic director, a commotion erupted outside. Evan stepped into the parking lot to find Officer Daniels leaning against his cruiser, watching two young men who were unloading donated supplies from a van. What's going on here? Evan asked, his voice steady but edged with irritation. Daniels smirked. Just checking things out, got a report about suspicious activity. Evan's eyes narrowed. Suspicious activity. They're volunteers bringing in supplies. Is that so? Daniels drawled. Mind if I take a look? Yes, I mind, Evan replied sharply. This is private property, and you're harassing people who are doing nothing wrong. Daniels straightened, his expression hardening. Watch your tone, Dr. Cole, I'm just doing my job. And I'm doing mine, Evan shot back. Unless you have a legitimate reason to be here, I suggest you leave. The tension crackled between them, drawing the attention of the clinic staff and patients. After a long moment, Daniels turned and got into his cruiser, slamming the door. The vehicle idled for a few seconds before pulling away. Evan stood there, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't the last he'd see of Daniels. The officer wasn't just acting out of idle curiosity. He was sending a message. Back in his office later that night, Evan replayed the day's events in his mind. The veiled hostility from Daniels, the dismissive tone of the board, the reporters' loaded questions. It all pointed to the same underlying issue. His success, his position, his very presence. It disrupted the comfortable status quo in Millbrook. And that disruption made him a target. Evan clenched his fists, his frustration simmering. He had spent his entire life proving himself, breaking barriers, and exceeding expectations, only to find that no amount of achievement could shield him from the insidious grip of prejudice. But giving in to anger wouldn't solve anything. He had to remain composed, professional. He couldn't afford to be seen as angry or difficult. Those labels would only play into the narrative his detractors were trying to construct. Instead, he channeled his frustration into action. Pulling out a notepad, he began jotting down ideas, ways to strengthen the clinic's programs, strategies to rally community support, talking points for the next board meeting. If they wanted to test his resolve, they'd find out just how unshakable he was. The next week began with a storm, both literally and figuratively. Rain lashed against the windows of Millbrook Memorial Hospital as Dr. Evan Cole sat in his office, poring over another round of reports. Despite his efforts to push forward with the clinic expansion, resistance had only grown more intense. Calls and emails poured in from community members, some offering support, but many voicing baseless complaints and thinly veiled accusations. It was just past noon when Jenna, his assistant, knocked lightly on the door. Her expression was tight, her usual calm demeanor replaced with a hint of worry. "Dr. Cole, you should see this," she said, holding out her phone. Evan took the phone, his stomach tightening as he read the headline. Millbrook Clinic, or magnet for troubled residents concerned over Dr. Cole's ambitions. The accompanying article was riddled with insinuations, claims that the clinic was a hotspot for illegal activity, that it was drawing undesirables to the area, and that Evan's leadership was putting the community at risk. Quotes from anonymous sources painted a picture of negligence and recklessness. Evan's jaw tightened. "This is complete fabrication." "I thought you should know," Jenna said softly. "It's spreading on social media too. Some of the comments." She hesitated, her voice trailing off. Evan knew what she wasn't saying. The comments would be brutal, racist, personal, and vile. They always were. He handed the phone back, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll handle it." Later that day, Evan's resolve was tested further when he arrived at the clinic. The parking lot was unusually crowded, with a handful of protesters holding signs that read, "Protect our neighborhood," and "No more loitering." The words stung, not because they were true, but because of how easily fear and ignorance could be weaponized. A woman in her 60s, wearing a rain poncho, stepped forward as Evan got out of his car. Her face was pinched with anger. "We don't want this place bringing trouble to our town," she snapped. "You're ruining this community." Evan took a steadying breath. "Ma'am, the clinic is here to serve the community. We provide care to families, children, and seniors, people who otherwise wouldn't have access to health care." "That's not what we've heard," another protester chimed in. "We've heard there's drugs, theft, all kinds of crime around here since this clinic opened." Evan's voice remained calm, though his patience was fraying. "Those are baseless accusations. If you have concerns, I encourage you to speak with me directly, or visit the clinic yourself to see the work we're doing." The crowd murmured, their faces a mix of skepticism and defiance. Before the situation could escalate further, Clara, the diner owner and longtime ally, stepped out of the clinic. Her presence seemed to soften the tension, though her sharp glare made it clear whose side she was on. "Enough of this nonsense," Clara said firmly. "Dr. Cole has done more for this town than most of you combined. You should be thanking him, not harassing him." The protesters shifted uncomfortably, but a few lingered, their hostility unabated. Evan nodded his thanks to Clara before heading inside, though the confrontation weighed heavily on him. As the week wore on, the harassment escalated. Anonymous complaints were filed with the hospital board, alleging mismanagement and impropriety on Evan's part. More articles surfaced, each more inflammatory than the last. Then came the final blow. It happened on a Friday evening. Evan was at the clinic, reviewing patient files, when two police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, their flashing lights cutting through the dimming twilight. Officer Daniels was the first to step out, his expression smug. Evan met him outside, the tension palpable. "What's this about, Officer Daniels?" "We've received a report of stolen medical supplies being distributed from this clinic," Daniels said, his tone dripping with mock authority. "We're here to conduct a search." Evan's stomach sank. He knew this was another baseless accusation, but the optics were damning. Patients and staff watched from inside as Daniels and his team began rifling through the clinic, their movements slow and deliberate, designed to create a spectacle. "This is harassment," Evan said, his voice low but firm. "You have no evidence, no cause for this." Daniels smirked. "Just doing my job, Dr. Cole. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about." The search turned up nothing, as Evan had expected, but the damage was done. By the time the officers left, half the town knew about the raid, thanks to bystanders filming the scene and posting it online. That night, Evan sat in his living room, staring blankly at the wall. The weight of the week's events pressed down on him like a vice. He thought about everything he'd worked for, the years of sacrifice, the endless battles to prove himself, and how quickly it could all be unraveled by prejudice and fear. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Mitchell, a lawyer and longtime friend. "Evan, I just saw the video from the clinic," Mitchell said, his voice tight with anger. "This has gone too far. Daniels is out of control." Evan exhaled slowly. "I know. But what can I do? Every step I take, they twist it against me." "You fight back," Mitchell said firmly. "You've got allies, Evan, people who believe in what you're doing. Let us help you." Evan hesitated. He'd always been reluctant to lean on others, preferring to fight his battles alone, but this was bigger than him now. The clinic, the community, it was all at stake. "All right," he said finally. "What do you have in mind?" Mitchell's response was immediate. "First, we file a formal complaint against Daniels. Then we launch a public campaign to counter their narrative. We need to make this about the truth, not their lies." The next day, Evan and Mitchell met with a small group of trusted allies, including Clara and a few hospital staff members. Together, they began devising a strategy. Clara suggested hosting a community event at the clinic to showcase its work and rally support. Mitchell proposed reaching out to local and national media to expose Daniels' actions and highlight the systemic issues at play. As they planned, Evan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just defending himself, he was standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced or marginalized. But he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Daniels and his allies weren't going to back down, and the stakes were only growing higher. As the meeting wrapped up, Evan's phone buzzed with a text from Jenna. "Urgent. Anonymous tip sent to board claiming clinic funds are being misused. They're launching an internal review." Evan's heart sank. The attacks were becoming more coordinated, more insidious. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his allies. "They're trying to shut us down," he said quietly. Mitchell nodded grimly. "Then we fight harder." Outside, the rain began to fall again, its steady rhythm echoing Evan's resolve. The storm wasn't over, but neither was his fight. The following week was a relentless wave of tension, pushing Dr. Evan Cole further into the eye of the storm. After the public spectacle of the police raid at the clinic, the attacks became sharper, more coordinated, and far-reaching. Every step forward seemed to be met with 2 steps back, as those determined to undermine him grew bolder in their efforts. Monday morning began with a bombshell. As Evan parked at the hospital, his phone buzzed with an urgent email from the hospital board. The subject line read, "Notice of formal inquiry, financial misconduct allegation." His stomach twisted as he read the details. An anonymous source had claimed that clinic funds were being misappropriated, specifically suggesting that Evan had siphoned money for personal use. The email requested his immediate presence at a board meeting that afternoon. The timing was no coincidence. This was Daniels' influence at work, stirring chaos and leveraging institutional power to cripple him. Evan couldn't ignore the pointed attacks. This was more than just professional rivalry, it was systemic bias rearing its head in full force, determined to silence a black man who had risen too far above what some considered his station. The meeting was tense from the moment Evan entered the room. The air was thick with discomfort, the board members glancing at him with varying degrees of doubt and suspicion. Mr. Ellsworth, one of his most vocal critics, opened the discussion. "Dr. Cole, these allegations are serious," Ellsworth began, his tone calculated. "The integrity of this institution depends on our ability to ensure transparency and accountability." Evan met his gaze evenly. "And I fully support transparency, Mr. Ellsworth. But these accusations are baseless. I've overseen every financial decision at the clinic, and our records are impeccable. I invite you to review them. Ellsworth leaned back, feigning contemplation. Of course we will. But in the meantime, these accusations are damaging. Both to your reputation and to the hospital's public confidence is paramount. This isn't about public confidence, Evans said, his voice steady, despite the anger simmering beneath. This is about systemic bias targeting a program that serves marginalized communities. Let's not pretend otherwise. The room fell silent. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Mrs. Price, one of the more sympathetic members, finally spoke. Dr. Cole, if what you're saying is true, then this is a grave injustice, but we need hard evidence to counter these claims. Perception, unfortunately, carries as much weight as facts in situations like this. Evan nodded, appreciating her candor. Then let's gather the evidence. I'll provide every record, every document. I have nothing to hide. The day grew darker, both figuratively and literally, as storm clouds gathered over Millbrook. That evening, Evan attended a hastily organized town hall meeting. The protesters from the clinic had demanded the event, framing their concerns as a community issue. The town council, eager to appease them, agreed to hold the meeting at City Hall. Evan stood at the back of the packed room, scanning the faces of the crowd. There were familiar allies, Clara, Mitchell, a few clinic staff, but they were outnumbered by the protesters, whose signs and whispers carried venomous energy. Officer Daniels loomed near the entrance, leaning against the wall with a smug grin, as if watching his plans unfold. The microphone crackled as the first speaker, a middle-aged man named Richard Palmer, took the stage. He was a local business owner who had long opposed the clinic, claiming it was bad for property values. "We've worked hard to build a safe, respectable community here," Palmer said, his voice sharp with indignation. "But since the clinic opened, we've seen nothing but trouble, loitering, theft, and now reports of mismanagement. Dr. Cole may have good intentions, but his program is tearing this town apart." Applause rippled through the room, emboldening others one by one. They took the microphone, spouting baseless accusations and thinly veiled racism. Evan's anger simmered, but he forced himself to remain composed. Losing his temper here would only validate their narrative. When it was finally his turn to speak, Evan approached the podium with measured steps. The room quieted, though the tension was palpable. "The clinic exists to serve this community," he began, his voice steady. "We provide critical health care to families, seniors, and individuals who would otherwise go without. The accusations you've heard tonight are not just false, they're harmful. They undermine the work we're doing and the trust we're building." A murmur spread through the crowd, but Evan pressed on. "If you have concerns, come see the clinic for yourself. Meet the patients, the staff, the volunteers. See the good that's being done, but don't let fear and misinformation dictate your judgment." The room erupted into chaos, some cheering, others shouting him down. Daniels smirked from his corner, clearly satisfied with the discord. Clara stood and clapped loudly, her defiance cutting through the noise, but it wasn't enough to drown out the hostility. As Evan stepped away from the podium, he caught Mitchell's eye. His friend's expression was grim, but there was a spark of determination there. They weren't beaten yet. The next morning, Mitchell called with startling news. "Evan, you're not going to believe this," he said, urgency in his voice. "I've been digging into Daniel's record. He's got a history of targeting minority-run businesses and organizations." Evan's grip tightened on the phone. "How has he gotten away with it?" "Because he's careful," Mitchell said. "Most of the complaints never made it past internal reviews, but there's a pattern. I'm sending you everything I've found." Evan's heart pounded as he opened the email. The evidence was damning: reports of over-policing, fabricated charges, and harassment, all directed at businesses and programs similar to the clinic. Daniels wasn't just targeting Evan, he was perpetuating a systemic pattern of abuse. This was the break they needed. That evening, Evan convened his allies at Clara's diner. The room buzzed with urgency as Mitchell laid out the evidence against Daniels. "This is our chance to turn the tables," Mitchell said. "We go public with this expose Daniels for what he is, and show the community what's really happening." Evan nodded, his resolve hardening. "We can't let this continue, not just for me, But for everyone he's hurt. Clara leaned forward, her eyes fierce. You've got our support, Evan, whatever you need. As the group discussed their next steps, Evan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be perilous, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like they had the upper hand. But as they finalized their plan, a text lit up Evan's phone. Urgent. Daniels is at the clinic with a warrant. They're shutting it down. The room fell silent as Evan read the message aloud. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The air outside the clinic was heavy with tension. Red and blue lights flashed against the darkened sky, casting distorted shadows on the building's facade. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the parking lot, murmuring anxiously, as Officer Daniels stood by the clinic's entrance, a rolled-up warrant in hand. Dr. Evan Cole pulled up, his chest tight with a mix of frustration and resolve. His allies, Mitchell, Clara, and a few clinic staff, had arrived moments earlier and now stood together, their faces grim. Daniels turned as Evan approached, a smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, Dr. Cole, glad you could join us." "What is this?" Evan demanded, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "What are you trying to pull now?" Daniels unfolded the warrant with exaggerated casualness. "We've received credible information that this clinic is housing stolen medical supplies. We're here to investigate." Evan glanced at the crowd, then back at Daniels. "This is harassment, plain and simple. You have no evidence, and you know it." Daniels shrugged. "The warrant says otherwise. Now step aside, or I'll have to remove you myself." Mitchell stepped forward, his legal expertise cutting through the rising tension. "Officer Daniels, this warrant is flimsy at best. You've provided no substantial cause, and this search is a clear abuse of power." Daniels' smirk faltered for a moment, before he leaned closer, his voice low and menacing. "Careful, counselor, you don't want to find yourself in trouble too." Evan took a step forward, placing himself between Daniels and the clinic entrance. His voice was calm but firm, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This stops now. You've targeted this clinic, these volunteers, and me, because we're disrupting your status quo, but I won't let you destroy what we've built." Daniels straightened, his smirk replaced by a scowl. "Don't play the martyr, Cole. You think you're untouchable, because you've got a title and a fancy degree? Newsflash, you're not. People like you always think you can waltz in and change things, but this town doesn't need your kind of help." The words hung in the air, their venom unmistakable. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Clara, standing near the front, crossed her arms and shouted, "We all heard that, Daniels! You've gone too far this time!" Evan's heart pounded, but he refused to flinch. Instead, he took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. "This is exactly what we're fighting against: corruption, prejudice, and abuse of power. Daniels doesn't care about justice, he cares about maintaining control, and he's willing to destroy lives to keep it." Daniels's face darkened, his composure cracking. "That's enough." "No," Evan interrupted, his voice rising. "You've harassed my staff, targeted innocent people, and lied to the community, but your time is up. We have evidence of your misconduct, years of it, and tonight, everyone will see you for what you really are." Mitchell stepped forward, holding a folder of documents. "We've obtained records of your actions, Daniels' false reports, coerced testimonies, targeting minority-owned businesses. It's all here." Daniels scoffed, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Mitchell shot back. "This folder is just the start. We've submitted complaints to the Department of Justice and alerted the media. Your abuses will no longer be hidden." The crowd murmured, their earlier skepticism shifting toward anger. Several onlookers pulled out their phones, recording the exchange. Daniels' bravado faltered as he realized the situation was slipping out of his control. "You think you can take me down with paperwork?" Daniels growled. "This town knows who I am. They'll believe me over you." Evan stepped closer, his voice steady and resolute. "Not anymore. The truth is out, Daniels. You can't hide behind your badge forever." Daniels' face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Evan thought the officer might lash out. Instead, Daniels barked an order to his subordinates. "Search the clinic now." The officers hesitated, glancing at the crowd, and then at Evan. The weight of public scrutiny had clearly unnerved them. One of them muttered, "Maybe we should wait." I said search the clinic, Daniels roared. Evan raised a hand, addressing the officers directly. You don't have to follow an illegal order. Look around you. Do you want to be complicit in this? The younger officer, Whitaker, exchanged a glance with his partner before stepping back. I'm not doing this, he said quietly. This isn't right. Daniels turned on Whitaker, his fury spilling over. You're done, I'll see to it personally. No, you won't, a new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see Chief Harper, the head of the police department, stepping out of a patrol car. Her expression was unreadable as she approached the scene. What's going on here? Harper asked, her gaze sweeping over Daniels, the crowd, and Evan. Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but Evan beat him to it. Chief Harper, Daniels has been harassing this clinic under false pretenses. We have evidence of his misconduct, and he's using this raid to cover his tracks. Harper turned to Daniels, her voice cold. Is that true? Daniels sputtered, his bravado crumbling. He's lying. They're all lying. But the damage was done. The crowd, now fully against him, jeered and called for accountability. Harper's expression hardened as she looked back at Daniels. You're relieved of duty pending an investigation. Hand over your badge and weapon. The crowd erupted into cheers as Daniels reluctantly complied, his face pale with shock. He shot Evan a venomous glare before turning and walking away, his career in tatters. Evan felt a surge of relief, but knew the fight wasn't over. As the crowd began to disperse, he turned to Mitchell and Clara. This is just the beginning. We need to make sure the clinic survives this, and that the systemic issues Daniels represents are addressed. Mitchell nodded. We're with you, Evan, all the way. But even as the victory settled over them, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that the battle had left scars, on him, on the clinic, and on the community. The road ahead would be long, but tonight, they had taken a crucial step toward justice. The clinic parking lot was a battlefield. The crowd, a mix of community supporters and skeptics, gathered under the harsh glare of the overhead lights. Officer Daniels stood at the forefront, his posture rigid, his face twisted into a smug grin, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Behind him, the red and blue lights of the police cruisers flashed ominously. Dr. Evan Cole stepped forward, his heart pounding, but his resolve steady. This was the moment he had anticipated, the moment he had dreaded. For months, Daniels had used every tool at his disposal to undermine Evan's work, to paint him as a villain in his own story. But tonight, the tables were about to turn. Daniels held up a warrant, his voice loud enough to carry over the murmurs of the crowd. By order of the Millbrook Police Department, we're conducting a full search of this clinic for stolen medical supplies. Step aside, Dr. Cole. Evan's voice was calm but firm. There are no stolen supplies here. This is an abuse of power, and you know it. Daniels chuckled darkly. Is that so, because we've received credible tips about illegal activity happening under your watch? Or are you saying the law doesn't apply to you, Dr. Cole? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Clara, standing near the front, called out. This is ridiculous and you know it. Daniels, stop hiding behind your badge. Daniels' smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Stay out of this, Clara. This isn't about you. It's about holding everyone accountable, even self-righteous doctors. Evan stepped closer, meeting Daniels' gaze. You want to talk about accountability. Let's talk about yours. Daniels stiffened as Evan gestured toward Mitchell, who stepped forward, holding a thick folder. This, Evan said, his voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear, is a record of your misconduct, Officer Daniels' complaints, filed by business owners, community leaders, and even some of your fellow officers. Patterns of targeting minority-owned businesses, coerced statements, fabricated charges. The crowd gasped, and Daniels' face turned a shade paler. What are you talking about? He snapped, though his voice wavered. Evan pressed on. We've gathered testimony from those you've harassed, and evidence from internal reports. You've used your badge as a weapon to uphold your biases, not the law. Mitchell opened the folder and began reading. 2017, false arrest of a black shop owner. 2019, unlawful search of a Latino-owned restaurant. 2021, harassment complaints from employees at a women's shelter, all swept under the rug. Daniels lunged forward, grabbing the folder out of Mitchell's hands and throwing it to the ground. You have no idea what you're talking about. These are baseless accusations. Evan didn't flinch. They're the truth, and tonight, this community sees you for who you really are. Daniel's composure cracked entirely. You think you can stand there, in front of all these people, and destroy my career? Who do you think you are? I'm someone who refuses to be silenced, Evan replied, his voice unwavering. I've worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let people like you tear it all down. This clinic is here to serve the community, and I won't let your hate and corruption stop us. Daniel's lips curled into a sneer. You're nothing but a fraud, a hypocrite pretending to be a savior. You think you're better than everyone else, but you're not. Evan took a step closer, his voice steady and powerful. I don't pretend to be perfect, but I know the difference between right and wrong. And I know this. Tonight, your reign of fear ends. At that moment, another voice rang out, one Evan didn't expect. It was Officer Whitaker, one of Daniel's subordinates, his expression conflicted but resolute. Sir, I can't do this anymore. Daniels turned sharply. What did you just say? Whitaker squared his shoulders. I'm not going to be part of this. I joined the force to protect and serve, not to harass innocent people. You've crossed too many lines. The crowd murmured in surprise, some even clapping. Daniel's fury was palpable as he stalked toward Whitaker. You think you're some kind of hero? You're done, you'll never work in law enforcement again. No, a new voice cut in. Chief Harper emerged from the crowd, her expression unreadable. All eyes turned to her as she walked deliberately toward Daniels. The only one who's done here is you. Daniels faltered. Chief, I was just abusing your power again. Harper's voice was cold and unyielding. I've reviewed the reports, Daniels. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full investigation. The crowd erupted in cheers as Daniel's face crumbled. You can't do this, he said, his voice shaking. You need me. No, Harper replied. This department needs integrity, and you've been a stain on it for far too long. As Daniels was escorted away by his own colleagues, the crowd surged toward Evan, offering congratulations and words of support. But amid the relief, Evan's mind raced. The fight was far from over. The clinic was still under threat, and the systems that enabled Daniel's behavior remained intact. Mitchell approached, placing a hand on Evan's shoulder. We did it, he said, a rare smile breaking through his serious demeanor. Evan nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. This is just one battle. We need to ensure the clinic survives this, and we need to push for real reform. Daniels is a symptom, not the disease. Clara stepped forward, her voice firm. You've got us, Evan. Whatever comes next, we're with you. As the crowd began to disperse, Evan glanced at the clinic, its lights glowing softly against the night. This was his moment of reckoning. The question wasn't whether he would fight. It was how far he was willing to go to ensure the community's survival and justice for those who had been wronged. The night was quiet now, the storm temporarily calmed, but in the stillness, Evan felt the weight of what lay ahead. The battle wasn't over. It was only beginning. The morning after the confrontation, the town of Millbrook was buzzing with news of Officer Daniels' suspension. Local news outlets ran headlines like, Corruption Exposed, Millbrook Officer Suspended Following Clinic Raid, and Community Rallies Behind Dr. Evan Cole in Fight for Justice. Social media lit up with videos from the previous night, showing Daniel's meltdown and Chief Harper's decisive action. For the first time in months, Evan felt a flicker of relief. Daniels was no longer in a position to wield his power unchecked, and the community had witnessed his corruption firsthand. But Evan also knew this was just the beginning. The fight against systemic injustice would require far more than one man's downfall. Within days, a formal investigation into Daniel's misconduct began. Whistleblowers like Officer Whitaker came forward, adding their voices to the growing mountain of evidence. The findings were damning. Daniels had falsified reports, coerced confessions, and targeted minority-owned businesses and community programs, all under the guise of maintaining order. As the evidence piled up, Daniels's allies began to distance themselves. Even those who had once defended him could no longer deny the truth. The police department announced that Daniels had been officially terminated and would face criminal charges for abuse of power and civil rights violations. For Evan, this was a victory. not just for himself, but for the countless others who had suffered under Daniels' watch. However, it was a bittersweet triumph. Daniels was a product of a system that had enabled him, and dismantling that system would take far more effort. The experience had changed Evan. He'd always believed in justice and equality, but facing such blatant and personal injustice had deepened his resolve. He realized that his position as a leader in the community came with both privilege and responsibility. He could no longer afford to assume that his work alone would shield him from prejudice. Instead, he had to confront it head-on, not just for himself, but for the people who looked to him for hope and guidance. Evan's perspective also shifted in more personal ways. For years, he had avoided asking for help, believing that he needed to bear the weight of his work alone, but the support of allies like Mitchell, Clara, and Officer Whitaker had shown him the power of collective action. Together, they had achieved what he could not have done alone. Daniels' removal sparked a broader conversation about policing. In Millbrook, Chief Harper, eager to restore public trust, announced sweeping reforms within the department. These included mandatory bias training, the establishment of an independent oversight committee, and increased transparency in handling complaints. The clinic also became a focal point for change. Evan and Clara organized a town hall meeting to discuss the challenges faced by the community and to propose solutions. What began as a tense gathering turned into a powerful moment of unity. Residents who had once been skeptical of the clinic came forward to share their stories and voice their support. Evan also worked with civil rights organizations to push for broader reforms at the state level. His efforts gained national attention, with advocacy groups citing Millbrook as an example of how communities could hold institutions accountable and demand change. One evening, a week after Daniels' termination, Evan found himself standing outside the clinic. The parking lot was quiet, the faint glow of the building's lights reflecting off the pavement. Clara joined him, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You've done good, Evan," she said, handing him a cup. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Evan nodded, taking a sip. "It's strange, I thought I'd feel more triumphant, but all I can think about is how much work there's still left to do." "That's because you care," Clara said with a small smile. "And that's why you'll keep fighting." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past few months settling over them. Despite the challenges, Evan felt a sense of peace. He had faced the storm and come out stronger. The clinic was still standing, and the community was rallying behind it. It wasn't everything, but it was enough for now. As the weeks passed, Evan began to think about the next steps. The clinic had weathered the storm, but its future depended on continued support and funding. Evan started reaching out to philanthropists and organizations, determined to expand the clinic's reach and solidify its place in the community. He also knew there were unresolved threads. The police department's reforms were a step in the right direction, but real change would take years of vigilance. Evan decided to form a coalition of community leaders to monitor progress and advocate for additional measures. At home, Evan found new purpose in his personal life. He made more time for his family and began mentoring young doctors, hoping to inspire the next generation of leaders. His daughter Maya watched him with newfound admiration, seeing not just a father, but a man who had stood tall in the face of injustice. One day, Evan received an email from a woman named Sofia Ramirez. She had seen the videos of his confrontation with Daniels and wanted to share her story. Years earlier, she had owned a small bakery in a neighboring town, but had been driven out of business by similar harassment. Her message ended with a simple yet profound statement: "Your fight has given me hope, thank you." Evan stared at the screen, the words sinking in. For all the exhaustion and frustration, moments like this made it worth it. The fight was far from over, but he wasn't fighting alone. Together, they could build something better, a community where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. As Evan closed his laptop and prepared for another day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The days following the upheaval at the clinic brought a calm that felt almost foreign to Dr. Evan Cole. For months, his life had been dominated by a relentless battle, against Officer Daniels, against systemic corruption, and against the quiet doubts that whispered, "Why fight at all?" Now, standing on the other side of that storm, Evan found himself reflecting on what had changed, not just in the world around him, but within himself. Evan had always seen himself as a man of quiet action, someone who made his impact through hard work and dedication. But this ordeal had taught him a painful truth. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant stepping out of the shadows and into the spotlight. The fight with Daniels had pushed him to confront his fears of failure, of public scrutiny, and of the deeply ingrained biases that could reduce a man's achievements to dust with a single accusation. This struggle reshaped Evan's understanding of justice. It wasn't enough to heal the sick or provide care for the underserved. True justice meant dismantling the systems that perpetuated inequality and oppression. It was a lesson hard-earned, but one that gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Evan had also learned to lean on others. People like Mitchell, Clara, and Officer Whitaker had stood by his side when the weight of the fight felt unbearable. Their support reminded him that no battle worth fighting was ever fought alone. And in the process, he discovered the power of community. The same community he had spent years trying to uplift. Evan's story was not unique, and that was both its tragedy and its power. Across the country, countless others faced the same systemic biases that had targeted him. His experience was a reflection of a deeper problem, a society where power was often wielded unfairly, where the color of one's skin could dictate how they were seen, treated, and judged. The events in Millbrook had sparked a larger conversation, not just about Daniels, but about the structures that enabled him. The police department's reforms, while significant, were only a starting point. Evan knew that change would require continued pressure, vigilance, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. The communities rallying around the clinic also spoke to a broader truth. People were hungry for change. They wanted systems that served them, not systems that exploited their vulnerabilities. Evan's fight had given them a glimpse of what was possible, a world where accountability wasn't just a word, but a reality. Evan's journey was far from over, but it had left him with a message he felt compelled to share. At a press conference outside the clinic, surrounded by supporters and journalists, he spoke from the heart. We all have a responsibility to fight for justice, not just for ourselves, but for those who don't have a voice. The battle we fought here in Millbrook is not an isolated one. It's part of a larger struggle that touches every corner of our society. Change is possible, but it demands action. It demands that we hold those in power accountable, and that we challenge the systems that perpetuate inequality. It demands that we come together as a community, united by a shared vision of fairness, dignity, and respect for all. This clinic is more than just a building. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we refuse to back down in the face of injustice. Let it remind us that the fight is worth it, that progress is possible, and that together, we can build a better world. The crowd erupted in applause, but Evan's words were not just for them, they were for himself. They were a reminder of why he had chosen to stand up, even when the odds felt insurmountable. The clinic thrived in the weeks and months that followed. Donations poured in from supporters across the country, ensuring its long-term stability. Volunteers and staff, inspired by Evan's leadership, worked tirelessly to expand its services and outreach. What had once been a small operation became a beacon of hope, drawing people from neighboring towns and cities. Evan also became a voice for broader reform, speaking at conferences and joining coalitions aimed at addressing systemic racism and inequity. His fight had begun in Millbrook, but its impact reached far beyond its borders. For the community, the events surrounding the clinic became a turning point. Conversations about race, power, and justice became more open and honest. Neighbors who had once viewed each other with suspicion found common ground. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a start. Despite the victories, Evan knew there was still work to be done. The systems that had enabled Daniel's behavior were deeply entrenched, and reform would take years of effort. But Evan felt ready for the challenge. He wasn't naive about the road ahead, but he carried with him the lessons of his journey, the strength of resilience, the power of community, and the importance of standing up for what was right. There were also personal threads to follow. Evan wanted to spend more time mentoring young doctors, ensuring that the next generation of leaders understood the intersection of medicine and social justice. He wanted to teach his daughter Maya to be proud of her identity and to use her voice fearlessly. and he wanted to continue building the relationships that had sustained him through his darkest moments. As the sun set over Millbrook one evening, Evan stood outside the clinic, watching families come and go. Clara joined him, as she often did, handing him a cup of coffee. "You've done something incredible here," she said, her voice warm with admiration. Evan shook his head, a small smile on his lips. "We've done something incredible. None of this would have happened without you, Mitchell, Whitaker, and everyone who believed in this place." Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the vibrant scene before them. "What's next for you, Evan?" He thought for a moment, the weight of the past months mingling with the promise of the future. "Keep fighting, keep building, and maybe, just maybe, make this world a little better for Maya and everyone else coming after us." The two of them stood in comfortable silence, the glow of the clinic's lights reflecting their shared sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was full of possibility. Evan took a deep breath, feeling the crisp evening air fill his lungs. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Not just for himself, but for the community, the system, and the change they were beginning to create. And with that hope came a quiet determination to keep moving forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead.